One of the greatest dangers we as writers tend to have, especially if we care about our work, is getting just a little bit too attached to one of our own characters. Hence the term Mary Sue. Now, that term is thrown around just a little bit too much, in my opinion, along with many other terms I could talk about off the top of my head. But even if it doesn't go to full born Mary Sue ness, even if it doesn't become to the point where it's like, oh my god, this is ridiculous, sometimes when a particular writer or author really just wants to emphasize a given character over and over and over again, it gets a little tiring. I've talked throughout this entire series about bad, various kinds of bad. Probably appropriate given we're talking about Star Trek Voyager, right? But there have been several different types and kinds and varieties of bad. I talked about that a lot during Threshold, for example, and during Alliances. But Resolutions belongs to a brand I have encountered before, but is probably one of the worst examples I've seen thus far because Resolutions is what I have termed kind of loosely an awkward bad. You know, sometimes there's bad where you're just like, and sometimes there's bad where you just shut it off immediately. And then there's bad where it's like, you're just so fascinated, you just have to keep watching. And it's like, oh my god, you know. And then there's bad where you play it for a few seconds and then you pause it because you just don't want it to keep going. You know, it's just like, oh my god, why is this persisting? Why is this like this? Is she really, and is he, and are they, and is this, and is that? This episode belongs in that category. I really struggled through this one. It actually took me quite a while to get through the whole episode because I just kept having to pause it. I'm sorry. For anybody out there who really likes that episode, I apologize. But every so often I just had to pause and just be like, walk away, walk away. Now, I know the comment that's going to be leveled at me, so let me go ahead and address it directly right off the bat. It doesn't have to do with me being like, ew, icky romance. That's not the problem. I'll talk about the problem. But let's talk about romance while we're here. Let's talk about Star Trek and romance. Now, one of the things that used to be taken as read, weirdly enough, in television is the idea that there has to be romances amongst the main characters. I know that sounds a little bit weird to the modern generation, but that really did used to be kind of required. And then again, if you watch Game of Thrones, maybe it's not that weird. Anyways, the point being that there was a fairly, even before the term shipping exists, there was quite a bit of a shipping community, especially in Star Trek, constantly trying to get people together. And even the directors, the producers, etc., the writers, the people involved, wanted to introduce romance to several of the main characters. One of the most common ones was actually Janeway and Chakotay. In fact, I'd say it is the second most common shipping that comes along with Catherine Janeway herself. In case you're curious of the first most common, I'll give you a hint. It involves a 7. Anyways, so point here being that despite this continuous pressure, I guess is the way I want to call it, in my personal opinion, and I want to stress the way I say that, Star Trek usually doesn't do romance or relationships particularly well. Not really. I've actually sat down at one point in time with a friend and discussed all the various relationships, both short-term and long, amongst the various, across the whole Star Trek series. And we both agreed that there was basically only one that was really well done in all of Star Trek ever. Can you guess? I'll give you a few seconds here to think about it. I am talking about O'Brien and Keiko, actually. Their relationship was very real. They had a lot of very real, down-to-earth problems. They had a degree of genuine loyalty and commitment to each other, despite the fact that they had their issues. And it lasted. Now, that last point's interesting to point out, because how many of the relationships in Star Trek lasted? How did Worf and Jadzia's relationship, it turn out? How did you know what? I actually can't think of many. Oh well, I guess we could go with Odo and Kira as another good example here. But my point is, let's get off DS9. How about Picard and Beverly? Now I know some people could point out, well, in some cases those relationships lasted forever because the series ended. For example, Ezri and Bashir. I couldn't think of his name all of a sudden. But I think my overall point here, and I really hate to say this, is that in almost every case, this is my genuine opinion, by the way, that the reason these relationships usually failed, in my opinion, is because they didn't really go to the actors and actresses and get their buy-in on it. Because if you have a relationship between two actors who don't really have a lot of chemistry with each other and don't really, it's a different type of acting to act like that. Let's just put this out there. I mean, that sounds like a duh. But so if they don't have chemistry and if they can't perform in that manner, the net result is not going to be optimal. I mean, again, this sounds like a duh. So the idea here is if you're going to have something like that, you really want, in my opinion, to talk to the actual people playing the roles and say, well, no offense to the Worf Jadzia thing, but both Michael Dorn and the woman whose name I unfortunately can't think of right now didn't really feel like that was a thing. Didn't really feel it, and they didn't have great chemistry between each other. So even though it was rather well written for a Star Trek romance, it always fell just a little flat for me and for several people I've talked to about this because of the fact that they didn't get that buy-in. A better example is actually Odo and Kira, the one I just brought up, because both of them actively had no interest in it and in fact thought it was a mistake. Both actors thought it was like, no, this shouldn't be happening. And it kind of comes across in the performance because we're still human beings playing aliens and more aliens respectively, liquid aliens and solid aliens. But the point I'm trying to get across here is, ironically, the romance is probably the thing that works best in this episode, in my opinion, which is why I can say firmly that that's not why I just look at this episode and groan. Now, that being said, I do have two positives. I'm going to save those for the end. Well, not towards the end here. But this episode makes me just roll my eyes because this is practically... It's a little bit over the top, in my opinion, how much everyone is just so in love with Janeway. And I don't mean romantically. I mean just she's so amazing and so incredible. And everyone likes her. Let me make one thing clear. You never had to emphasize how awesome Kirk, Picard, or Cisco were. You ever notice that? They never had to have an episode just dedicated to how incredibly amazing they were. They just had the actors perform their roles, they had their actions speak for themselves, and they had a degree of, not humility so much as confidence. And I mention that because there's a difference between confidence and arrogance, if you understand what I mean. There's a difference between, I'm awesome, and I will accomplish this. And all three of those captains had a very much, I will accomplish this feeling, and so they were awesome. Janeway has much potential, many reasons to be an awesome captain. And in fact, I think she does pull off, especially with Mulgrew's performance, an awesome, captain feel for individual episodes throughout the course of the series. When you have an entire episode, and I want to stress this, an entire episode dedicated towards Janeway is awesome, because that is what this episode is. Resolutions equals I love Janeway. It's kind of the exact opposite of show don't tell. I guess it is literally because it is tell don't show. Rather than showing us anything about Janeway to show why she's such an incredible captain, everyone just constantly bemoans and talks about how much they miss her and how everything's terrible and blah 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 blah. And that's why I feel this episode is just kind of groan-worthy. This was one of the last episodes that was actually done by Jerry Taylor, and I've mentioned that name a few times before, and I apologize to the woman because I've never said her name positively. But she really, really had this Janeway fixation, and it really comes across in this episode. Jerry Taylor has gone on record as saying that of the first two seasons, this one was the best episode, in her opinion, of course. Now, she's allowed that. That's not what I'm talking about. The fact that she thinks this is the best episode of the first two seasons is indicative of the mentality that went into this episode. So, God, I don't even know where to begin. I actually have only a few notes here. Let's talk about something that's interesting. Did you know this episode takes place over the course of 3 months? If that fact surprises you, then congrats, because there were several of the creative staff who also had basically the same problem. Namely, the fact that the episode does take place over a fairly lengthy period of time, and yet it never really feels like it. It feels like it's just next day, and then the next day, and then the next day, and it's just normal, it's everyday existence, and then, oh, by the way, it's 3 months later. And yet and of course the funny thing is right at the end there's this coda where they just kind of slip right back into the roles of captain and commander, which would have worked a little bit better if it actually had been 3 months, because it would have been indicative of their characters, I think, and I think that was the intent. But it doesn't feel that way, so it kind of falls flat on its face in its execution. Let's also talk about Kate Mulgrew for a second. As I mentioned earlier, the romance aspect is probably one of the things that works best in this episode, because I think Robert Beltran and Kate Mulgrew do have chemistry and could have made that work. I really do. For some reason, they just kind of teased around that for a while, this probably being one of the worst teases, and then abandoned it flat on its face and never came back to it. We're not actually 100% sure why, even to this day, that was done. Because let me put it this way, in the original draft of this episode, the two actually do romantically get together, which probably doesn't surprise you if you've seen this episode. But if you have seen this episode, you also know that the two do not romantically get together in this episode. It is very explicit, the fact that they're bonding, certainly they're becoming friends, but there's no romantic tension between the two at all. It is actually almost like anti romantic tension, which is almost sad. But I mentioned Kate Mulgrew in this because she also agrees with me. She thinks there should have been a relationship between herself and Chakotay, which I find interesting because Robert Beltran actually had the exact opposite feeling on that one. He believed that nothing happened. There was just a professional relationship between two people who were very close. Well, I guess I'm saying this a little bit inaccurately, because she believes there should have been and he believes there wasn't, so I guess they're not actually incongruent. But I've never read anything from Robert Beltran saying whether or not he thinks there should have been, just from Kate Mulgrew. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Scorpion, which is probably the last episode that really touches on the whole Chakotay Janeway thing. But I just felt like mentioning that because, again, the two have some decent chemistry, and it's probably the only thing that salvages the planet-side scenes, the A-plot, if you will. Speaking of which, I mentioned earlier that this episode's all about how Janeway is awesome. Let me go ahead and tell you one of the reasons. This whole episode just screams that, but one of the reasons why that is. The A-plot is about Janeway stuck on the planet, how she refuses to let go of her past, refuses to let go of the hope for a cure, and Chakotay is trying to... I'm just going to say this right. It's something straight out of a pulp romance novel, because we've got the big rugged man out in the wilderness trying to get the way of the world's woman, trying to abandon her, to fall into the acceptance of the situation they are now in, and how they just grow fond of each other. It's literally right out of the pulp novel thing, which actually makes it more interesting when you think about the fact that originally they were supposed to hook up. But then we've got the B plot, which is all about the crew being pathetic. Now, okay, the cynics out there are like, well, it's Voyager, of course they are. But seriously, every single member of the crew we see in the B-plot is pathetic in their performance of, with one exception, I'll get to that in a minute, of how they're feeling about the loss of their captain. Now, let's make this clear. The loss of a captain is a big deal, especially one you've grown close to. And admittedly, by this point, these people have spent 2 years together, so that's not exactly that's not exactly a small period of time. I get that they're sad that Janeway's gone. If you're paying attention, you've already noticed the way I'm phrasing this, because you've probably seen this episode, you probably already get the point. No one's sad about Chakotay, really. Occasionally they will mention the commander or Chakotay as also being missing, but it's all about Janeway. It's all about the fact that the crew is so sad about the loss of their captain. Not their captain, and, oh yeah, their first officer, that guy too. I guess we could rescue him too while we're at it. And the levels, oh my god, the fact that they're actually, they go to the commander with a unique idea to try and save him doesn't bother me. The fact that they get worked up on it and violent about it doesn't really bother me a little bit. The fact that they keep going on about it, and again, let's keep in mind, this episode happens over 3 months, so months happen. I believe the first jump cut is actually a month, and a month has passed without their captain, and they're still moping. The scene with B'Elanna where she's just, whatever. That also kind of contributes to that thing I mentioned earlier. They're acting like it was yesterday, which would actually be a lot more understandable if it had been yesterday, if they were still in a malaise because they just lost their captain. But no, it's been a month because she's just that awesome. And they will go, God knows how long out of their way, because again, I want to stress this again, 3 months, which is about a month and a half there and a month and a half back in terms of overall travel. That's a huge loss of time because Janeway's awesome. Janeway is awesome. I'm sorry if I keep hammering this point in, but in my defense, the episode kept hammering the point in, so I'm just working with what I got here. Let's talk about one other thing this episode fails at. Tension. There is no feeling of tension in this episode, except with the exception. I'm still building up to that exception, because I do have positives to talk about. The total lack of tension in this episode is really, really, really evident when I'm watching it again, because it's like, okay, they're on the planet. And the first thing, they're in these coffin things, they're on the planet. Okay, that's attention grabbing. Nope, it immediately goes downhill by saying, you're stuck here forever because of a disease I can't cure, except if I get a hold of the Vidians. By the way, that's dropped right there in the intro, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I see where this episode's going. Oh, they're just leaving him down there, okay. Well, okay, now they're talking about monkeys, and there's a storm. I'll talk about the storm in a moment. And, and there's just, okay, and then there's the bath, because she really likes baths. Side note, it's just a little detail, but I kind of like the bath thing. It's a dinky little thing, but it's what I like to call flavor. DS9 did that a bit too. Every now and again there would be something about the incredible, wonderful technology that the future of Star Trek has, and then one person would be like, "Well, yeah, but we don't have blah," or "I don't have blah." You know what I mean, right? Deep Space Nine did this all the time. TNG did it several times. The point is, it's a dinky little thing where, yeah, I could just use the sonic shower, or yeah, I could just do this, but I just like taking a bath. It's just something I like. I'm sorry, it's a tiny little thing, but I gotta give this episode whatever props I can, because the whole time through this episode, up to this point, it was like, God, I don't know, 20 minutes in, I'm just sitting here like... Speaking of which... I don't have much else to say. I mean, I'm just looking down my notes here. It's like, okay. First of all, there's no feeling of tension. It's awkward and dull. And I'm going to quote Sci-Fi Debris here, even though this is actually another episode. But the crew members are throwing themselves on a funeral pyre, and they're just trapped within this malaise for months about Janeway. I actually counted 11 minutes and 29 seconds is literally nothing. There's no character development about Chakotay or the B-plot or anything. It is literally just Janeway. Nothing but. And then there's the sad about Janeway not Chakotay plot, and there's the B-plot, which is Janeway's awesome. There's the A-plot, which is Janeway's awesome. Now, let's talk about this storm, because that's my next point here. This storm is like... It's like the plot itself just intervened, because up to that point of the episode, Janeway has been stalwart in her firm belief that she must stick to her, her belief in finding a cure, and she must stay her research, and she must resist the wiles of this wonderful man, blah 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 blah. And then the storm happens, and she actually has a line. I forget the exact wording, forgive me, I didn't write it down. But it was basically, well, I guess I'm going to have to give up on my research, or there's no way I can do my research now. It was really, really overt, is my point. It was literally just, storm happens, now she can't continue. Now she has to accept the, the romance, pulp novel plot thing. Now... in the interest of being fair, I can totally see a character, how I perceive Janeway, being like that. Being the kind of character who would continue to persist in her ideas of trying to find a way out, trying to solve the problem, basically, trying to find the solution. That's very her. I'm with that. I really am. It's the presentation of it that's just so over the top and so basic. I'm sorry, but forgive me, this feels like something a 14-year-old wrote. And I don't mean that in like a complete negative, because it's just, there's no subtlety to it. There's no nuance to it. It's literally just, okay, and now this giant storm of doom, by the way, destroys all her research stuff and just trashes the area, and then goes away and is never heard from before or since. It's never even mentioned before or since, because it only served the purpose of shoving her forward, rather than having something done where, oh, I don't know, maybe she actually does grow fond of Chakotay. Maybe she starts to actually enjoy some of her life here. Maybe it's actually kind of a relief to her to not have to constantly decide who lives and who dies. What was the last episode? Tuvix? Remember? It would have been so easy to have her actually nuancedly, that's not a word, to sashay her way into this development. If you actually wanted her to slowly accept this life, there are so many ways you could do that, rather than just dropping rocks and everyone dying. You know, rocks fall, everyone dies. It was just so dumb. Oh. And then, oh, God, yeah, okay. I'll stop there. And then she's like, oh, and then the next scene is, instead of her, gradually growing or anything, it was just next scene, she's like, oh, I'm totally cool with being here now. Yep, someone flipped the switch, I'm cool. No subtlety, no nothing, no characterization, no arc, no plot, no, just yeah, I'm cool. It's great. This place is awesome. Hand me another mojito, would you? Alright, that's enough ranting. This is going to be a short episode, I can tell already looking at the timer there. Let's talk about some positives about this episode, because there are several, actually. First and foremost, Tim Russ. I know I've gushed about him before, but I have to gush about him here, because he is the only character that I feel presents any kind of appropriate anything in this whole episode. And I don't mean this really against the actors, so don't mistake that. But he is written as... Let's see, okay. I'm actually lying. See, I'm trying to praise him, but I'm still failing. Okay. Okay, let's... Okay. Even Tuvok is not actually written well in this episode, until a certain point. And I was trying to talk about the certain point, but then I realized I have to talk about the rest of the episode too, because that's how this works. So up to that certain point, which is when we'll finally start talking about positives, I swear, all we have is Tuvok being written like an Enterprise-era Vulcan, is how I would put that. And those of you who've seen that show know what a colossal insult that is. I actually feel bad for Tim Russ for how irritating it must have been to portray that role. He is portrayed as if there is a stick the size of a sequoia shoved you-know-where on Vulcan's third moon. And it's really kind of... It's the same thing the whole rest of the episode. It's awkward, it's embarrassing, it's eye-rolling, it's like, okay, whatever. And then out of nowhere, he just turns around and he starts acting like Tuvok again. This is when the episode actually comes into its own, and it's the only part of this episode I actually enjoyed. In fact, all these scenes that I'm about to talk about, I kind of forgot about, because whenever I think of resolutions, I think about the everything that's bad about the episode. The awkwardness, the poor presentation, the terrible writing. I'll forget about this thing. So, in this episode's defense, when we get to the culmination of the B plot, we have the Voyager crew going after a specific Vidian convoy, which happens to include Denora Pell, which was the Vidian that was on this show previously with the Doctor. She and he actually got a bit of a relationship thing going on. Oh my god. First of all, they're using continuity. That always gets an automatic thumbs up from me. Second of all, it's continuity that makes sense. Because the Vidians are incredibly advanced medically speaking, and what they want is some kind of solution for this particular virus, and the Vidians have it. makes sense. And again, it was teased like way back at the beginning of the episode, so awesome. Next thing I like, she actually puts on a pretty decent performance. The Vidians were actually planning to trap them, but she wasn't. All of this just makes perfect sense and actually flows rather naturally and well. Because it makes perfect sense that the Vidians would, as a whole, as a group, would totally agree to use Denora's connection to Voyager to lure Voyager in to harvest their organs, because they're evil, psychotic bastards. I'm summarizing, but you get the point. It is very logical that people that are that desperate and that far past sanity, I'll put it that way, would do that. Totally with that. I also agree that Denora would never have intended that and didn't even know about it. Totally agree with that. I also like the scene where she calls the doctor and she says in an almost pleading tone, I didn't know, you've got to believe me. And he immediately and without question says, I believe you. It's a really small, subtle point. But one of the things I understand personally, I'm sure many of you do as well, is when something happens and we weren't intending this, we weren't knowledgeable of this, we were not culpable in this. We want you to understand that, and we are desperate for you to understand that we didn't do this. We swear, and we'll try to make it right, because this was not our intent. And there's always that terror, that fear in the back of our minds that the other person will not believe it. And the fact that the doctor immediately and without hesitation, and with conviction and sincerity said, I believe you, it really spoke volumes in its own quiet way about the doctor's personality, his almost naivete, but at the same time his forthright simplicity and honesty. And it also kind of highlighted the extent to which their relationship, romantic and otherwise, had grown to. And I liked that. I also liked the fact that the plan was actually pretty well done, and is probably, in all honesty, I'd say the best battle sequence in all of the first two seasons of Voyager, in my opinion. It was simple in its own right. We didn't have a lot of effects shot. It was mostly just shots of the bridge and the characters. But the way it was presented was really well done. Tuvok had an actually good plan that didn't, and I can't believe I'm saying this, it didn't rely on technobabble. They were going to eject some antimatter, lower the shields, beam the thing over, raise the shields, fire a torpedo, detonate the antimatter, boom. Right on the enemy formation. There's no technobabble in that. They are outmatched and outgunned, and they are outthinking their opponent. I have to applaud, because that's the kind of thing, that's how it should work. I've talked about this before. Old Star Trek and Next Generation both, and DS9 as well in some occasions, really had a good handle on that sort of thing, but in Voyager it's kind of the rarity that they defeat an enemy using their brains, rather than just, we're going to whip up a quantum inverse tachyon pulse force destabilization bomb, and then that flips a switch over behind the scenes, and then that switch says win. It's an I win button, because there's a paladin back there. But the point being, it was a really good battle scene. It was really well executed. I like the way Tuvok presented it. That was Tuvok being Tuvok, by the way, which is the positive thing I wanted to mention there. And everyone was... in fact, by the way, just to give more praise to this scene, they can't beam through the shields. Now, I know that's a weird thing to say, because some people out there are going to be like, huh? And a lot of longtime Trekkers and Trekkies out there are going to go, because you know exactly what I'm talking about. The fact that they actually make a point of not being able to beam through the shields is awesome. Because let's just, for those of you who don't understand what I mean, let's just say Star Trek really likes to waffle on that issue back and forth as to whether or not they can or can't. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, sometimes they can and can't in the same episode. Sometimes they just do weird stuff. Anyways. Now, let's talk about changes to this episode. Two big changes, really, from me. First, I'm going to give full credit where credit is due. Kenneth Biller, of all people, actually wanted a different idea for this episode in its structure. Same basic root idea. Janeway and Chakotay over here, crew over here, trying to reunite. That the same basic structure remains the same. But he was going to use different flow of time in a time eddy, as he himself described it, in order to accomplish that, rather than they've got this random super virus that the Vidians have a cure for in their back junk drawer, and they just happen to be stuck on the planet because the planet is illogical in every way, shape, and form, because a virus that is only found on a planet cannot propagate on the planet because the planet provides the defense against the... I'm sorry, my brain's breaking. Hang on a second. Okay. Point being, he had a better idea, I think. And I would have... Not only would have been more science fiction-y, which, you know, cool, but more importantly, it would have made more sense. And it's really sad when a time eddy that allows time to flow at a different rate than other areas in space-time makes more sense than the actual plot of the episode. But I like that idea, so I would run with it. I would run with the idea that the two of them end up either thanks to a shuttlecraft or thanks to a mission, you know, they beam down, time flows at a different rate, they end up being stuck there for a long period of time, Voyager ends up trying to get them back, blah, blah, blah. If you're paying attention, you know that this idea has actually been used 2 other times in Voyager. Now, one of them was pretty blatantly pulled from a book, which I'll talk about that when we get there. But there is one other episode where this specific idea was actually expounded upon, specifically to get to use this episode idea, because Kenneth Miller really wanted to push that idea, and it's the episode, I forget the name of it, it's the one with Tuvok, Tom, and other people who end up on this planet, and they're only there for like an hour in outside time, but they're there for like, you know, however many months in their time. You know the episode I'm talking about if you've seen this episode, if you've seen this series, excuse me. Forgive me for not knowing the name off the top of my head, but that's the return to that idea. Regardless, I do think that idea would work better here. Same basic concept as that episode. You know, they beam down, time works differently. They're not being able to contact Voyager. It takes them some time to get used to it, blah, blah, blah. They're accustomed to life here. I would remove most of the challenges that were present in the Tuvok Tom episode, because those served a different purpose for the plot. That's not the point of the plot here. The point of the plot here is, forgive me for saying it, the development of the relationship and character growth of both Chakotay and Janeway. I would have them grow closer. I would not have them start a relationship here, because you know me, I like to do things slowly. I like to have a slow build. I don't like to just, bam, okay, you're together. Oh, bam, you're apart. You know, I don't like that. So I would have the definite first hints of them actually growing close in this episode and growing very fond of each other. Wouldn't do anything overly explicit. That being said, I would make it absolutely clear that the two of them are growing romantically attached to each other. And I would make it absolutely adamant that the two are very close friends in addition to that. And I probably shouldn't have to explain why. I also would probably go ahead and keep the Vidian plot basically the same way. And I know that sounds weird because of the whole time eddy thing, but the reason I would keep the Vidian plot in its same way, I would just execute it differently. Because rather than the Vidians having this random cure-all in their back pocket, I would have the Vidians just kind of happen into the area, basically. Voyager heads to this area, they want to investigate this planet, they beam them down, something goes wrong, the Vidians happen to be nearby, Voyager has to abandon the Janeway and Chakotay on the ground in order to protect the ship. That's the tough call Tuvok makes. Rather than, the captain ordered me away, he has to go ahead and make this command decision in order to basically abandon some crew members in order to save the rest of the ship. Then, because he's Tuvok, he has never actually fully abandoned them. He always had the intention to come back, and he reveals this as people, you know, approach him, like, you can't just abandon the captain there. You know, Harry Kim and B'Elanna, sure, keep those roles, why not? Have it come, rather than having them just be in this sulking thing, have them thinking about, okay, we need to find out a way to deal with this. And Tuvok says, yes, that's exactly what I need you to do, and I need you to figure out this, and I need you to figure out this. Have them figure out some way to outthink the Vidians. I would keep Dinara involved there. I would keep Dinara as the guest star on the other ship, have her, you know, basically unaware of the fact that they were fighting Voyager, unaware of that any of this was going on. That may sound weird until you realize that if you think about it, the everyday people on a ship who are not involved in the operation of a ship probably aren't too familiar with what's going on the ship in the long-term sense. And in fact, TNG actually has explored that episode, and so has DS9 for that matter. It's actually a concept I really like. The Lower Decks, by the way. TNG is the episode I'm thinking of. So she becomes aware, thanks to the chatter and call of what's going on and how they're hunting this, you know, this ship. And she's like, oh my god, it's Voyager. And so she contacts the Doctor, and, you know, she talks to Schmollis. I actually wrote the name down so I can remember. She actually calls him Schmollis in this episode, so, you know, good continuity on there. I would have her contact Schmollis. I would have her, you know, try to coordinate with them, and that would give them a little bit of an edge so they know exactly where the Vidians are going to be, that kind of a thing. And, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it ends up with them outthinking their way through the Vidians, disabling their ships, getting through, getting Captain and Chakotay back. And it turns out that it's been, you know, 3 months for them, whereas it's been, you know, a couple of hours for the Voyager crew. The end. That's how I would approach it, but that's just me. And I'm just a viewer with it. Wait, no, wrong thing. I'm sorry. Either way, I'm actually kind of looking forward to the next episode because we're almost at the end of season 2. The next episode is Basics.